The Panzer III was Germany's first mass-produced medium tank and a huge breakthrough in their Panzer program, not just in design, but also with industrial production. The first prototypes of the Panzer III were produced in 1936. They were rather unique compared to other nations as all tanks were equipped with an intercom system to improve crew coordination and communication. Also, they had radios, meaning all tanks could stay in constant communication and maneuver with great efficiency, which was key for the future German Blitzkrieg strategy. In total, 5,774 Panzer IIIs were built, with 13 variants of the tank and also 5 additional command tank variants, and 11 more conversions and specialist variants, making the Panzer III chassis the most used tank chassis by the German forces. The armaments for the Panzer III started with a 3.7cm main gun. This increased throughout the war, with the main gun being a 5cm gun varying in length, and by the final variant it was a short-barrelled 7.5cm main gun. There was also even a flame tank variant, with its main gun being a flamethrower. The coaxial weapon began with dual MG34 machine guns. This was then reduced to a single one, the larger 5cm and 7.5cm main guns being introduced. And all Panzer IIIs had a Hull MG34 machine gun, as was very common with World War II tanks. The armour for the Panzer III was initially very light, being from 5 to 16mm, but this was quickly remedied when it was found to be too weak to effectively defend the crew, and by the Panzer IIIe variant it had increased to 10 to 30mm, and as later variants were introduced it improved to a maximum of 60mm of armour, which was the Panzer IIIH, but this was done rather adaptively by welding two 30mm plate together to increase protection. Even with later Panzer IIIs being up to 60mm, this was still fairly light, and the fact that the arm was flat, not angled, did not help the tank in protection, with later models being given spaced armour that was up to 8mm thick. But at its best, it could only survive hits from light and medium AT weapons at range, and heavier dedicated AT weapons would penetrate the tank with ease, which German forces found out early in the war. The speed and mobility of the Panzer III was good, with the early variants capable of 21.7 miles per hour, and later variants able to get up to 26 miles per hour, which was a significant upgrade, and the range of the tanks was good also, with it being 102 miles for all variants up to the Panzer J, where it dropped slightly to 96.31 miles. The Panzer III was also very reliable, and as the war progressed it became a tried and tested chassis, which was why it was so popular for other vehicles to be based off. In combat, the Panzer III has a long combat history. Its first taste of combat was the invasion of Poland. The Panzer III variants used were the A, B, C and D variants, supporting the Panzer I and II and a low number of Panzer IVs. The tanks performed well, their main role being to use Blitzkrieg tactics to overwhelm and overrun the Polish forces, and with the Luftwaffe having been targeting enemy tanks and anti-tank guns, there was supposed to be little resistance. Unfortunately, there was still enemy armour and AT guns available, and they were more than capable of penetrating the Panzer III's very light armour, but the operation did allow Germany to perfect its new Blitzkrieg tactics and learn valuable lessons, but at a higher cost than expected. The next combat was Operation Weserbogen, the invasion of Norway and Denmark. Around 30 Panzer III's C and D variants were sent to support the ground forces. There was very little resistance, and with both nations lacking anti-tank weapons and tanks, and also the stellar performance of the Luftwaffe knocking out any real threats, the tanks saw little major combat and were mainly used as infantry support tanks. Now was the biggest test of the Panzer III. With the E, F and G variants present, they began their push west through the Benelux countries and the conquering of France, a huge task that would have to be done swiftly and aggressively. First, the Germans used their Blitzkrieg tactics to overwhelm and neutralise the lowland countries. With the support from airborne special forces and effective air support, the enemy stood no chance against the German war machine. But France laid ahead, and they were more numerous in tanks, with them being better armed and armoured, as was the British Expeditionary Forces. But the Panzer III had one major advantage: its radios allowing for amazing coordination. This was used to great effect by the German forces, and this allowed lighter armed tanks like the Panzer III to deal with stronger tanks. The Germans concentrated large amounts of their tank forces through the Ardennes, which was a weak spot in the French defence lines, and the Germans exploited this greatly. With the superior communication and combined arms, the Panzer III overcame its shortfalls, and even the mighty French Char B1 was outmanoeuvred and destroyed by far lighter vehicles. After Europe had fallen, the war against the British continued in North Africa. The Panzer III F and G variants made up the bulk of Rommel's tank forces. In the hot desert terrain, the Panzer III did well in terms of mobility and speed, and they were also capable with the new 50mm gun of destroying all but the Matilda with relative ease. But Africa was a tough fight, and even though much success was achieved, the weight of Allied opposition eventually began to take the toll on the German forces. Later in North Africa, the L&M variants arrived and showed great prowess against Allied tanks, but North Africa was lost and German forces had to retreat back to Europe, but the Panzer III once again proved its worth. Whilst the Africa campaign was raging, the Panzer III was also involved in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia and the Soviet Union. The Panzer III being the most numerous tank in the German forces, and now all Panzer IIIs involved were upgraded to the new 50mm main gun, this was more than capable of defeating the Russian main armoured forces, which were made up of light tanks such as the BT series and T-26. But problems began when they ran into the KV series with its thick 100mm armour and the T-34 with its strong sloped armour and its 76mm main gun, which easily defeated the Panzer III, which could not penetrate the KV series at all and could only penetrate the T-34 with the use of armour-piercing composite rigid rounds at close range. Also mixed with the harsh Russian winter, which created havoc on the Panzer III's equipment and engine, the Germans realised that the Panzer III was surely outclassed and the major frontline combat was now out of its reach. By 1943, the production of the new Panzer IIIs had ceased, and remaining Panzer IIIs would be all modified and upgunned to stay effective against the more modern enemy tanks. The Panzer III was still outclassed even with the M variant being introduced with a 75mm main gun. There was even an attempt to put the Panzer IV turret into the Panzer III chassis, but this failed, meaning the long-barrelled 75mm would never be mounted on the Panzer III. As Germany's advance stopped on all fronts and the defensive operations began, the Panzer III still saw a lot of combat, with the Panzer IIIs in Russia finding it impossible to deal with the huge amount of T-34s that were sent against them. In the Western Front, the Panzer III had some success when used in ambushes and aggressive counterattacks, but the M4 Sherman proved more than a match for it, especially when it was upgunned itself. And whilst the Italians fought back the Allied invasion, they were given Panzer III J and L variants, and due to Italy's mountainous terrain meaning tank engagements were at close range, the Panzer III was quite effective against those Allied tanks involved. In conclusion, I think the Panzer III truly was a breakthrough in German tank design, focusing on communication, speed and manoeuvrability, the main pillars of the Blitzkrieg. It was also a massive stepping stone in the development to the more powerful German tanks. And even though outgunned in all of its combat history, it still caused mayhem on its enemies and proved an absolute workhorse for the German forces, and it has gained my respects.